Ontario inhabitants are now poorer per capita than inhabitants of Mississippi, and that's the poorest American state.
America's GDP is massive. Canada's is not so much. But what does it actually mean? Does higher GDP make you happier, richer, and safer? Or is it just a scoreboard for politicians and economists to high-five each other? Canada's economy is 1/10 the size of the US, but Canadians have a couple things. They have free healthcare, less student debt, and somehow less national drama. Although there is some.
I come from a place of privilege, and I have endeavored in my life.
So, who's actually winning? Let's unpack the numbers and the nonsense behind GDP. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product, and total value of everything a country produces in a year. It includes goods, services, and yes, even overpriced Toronto condos and Taylor Swift tickets. The US has the biggest GDP in the world, over 28 trillion. Canada, about 2.5 trillion. So, America's economy is more than 10 times larger than Canada's. But is that the whole story? Spoiler alert, it's not. GDP is not necessarily wealth. Let's clear this up. A country can have a giant GDP and still have sky-high inequality, medical bankruptcy, people working 3 jobs and still being broke. GDP doesn't measure things like how wealth is shared, whether you have a crowdfund your surgery through GoFundMe, or if your paycheck vanishes the second you pay rent and gas. So when someone flexes with a high GDP, ask them, cool, so how's your rent going? Let's break down a few head-to-head comparisons between Canada and the US. Not just the GDP headline, but the things that actually affect people and how they live. Number 1 is GDP per capita. If we divide the total GDP by population, the US comes out ahead. Around $85,000 per person versus Canada's $65,000. Sounds impressive, right? But remember, averages can lie. If Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos walk into a bar, all of a sudden everyone there is a billionaire. But that's not actually the case. The GDP per capita stat hides the wild inequality baked into both economies. Not just the US, but Canadian one too. Let's look at the healthcare. Canada is free when you need it. Walk into a hospital, walk out without a 5-figure bill. Or a 6-figure. The US, it's more like hope you have an insurance or a rich uncle. But preferably both. Education debt. It's actually not too far off, Canada versus the US. Canadian students graduate with debt, but less of it, and often at slightly lower interest rates. About 26,000 Canadian on average. In the US, it's more like 37,000 US dollars, and that loan follows you around longer than your high school nickname. Can't claim bankruptcy or anything. Let's talk about housing. Both countries have housing problems, but Canada's are next level. Toronto and Vancouver are basically playgrounds for foreign investors, and buying a starter home in there, good luck, unless you're already a millionaire. In the US, cities like San Francisco or New York are incredibly pricey, sure, but at least there's more room to move somewhere affordable. In Canada, affordability is becoming a myth, which is quite tragic. Work-life balance. Americans clock in more hours, take fewer vacations, and retire later. Canadians? They take their paid time off, complain about the weather, and still manage to keep the economy chugging along somehow. And the happiness index. Despite GDP gap, Canada often ranks higher in global happiness surveys. Yes, the Canadians spend half the year in snow boots and thermal socks, but somehow they're smiling more. Here's the thing. GDP looks official, but it's not pure truth. You can inflate it in ways that don't help regular people. Let me clarify that. For example, war spending boosts GDP. Disaster recovery boosts GDP. Even pharma price hikes count as economic growth, somehow. A country can be spending more on insulin, bombs, or rebuilding after wildfires or tornadoes, and all of that adds to the GDP. When GDP goes up, it doesn't always mean things are getting better. Sometimes it just means people are paying more for the same life, or getting crushed while pretending they're fine. And of course, we have to mention the military-industrial complex. You want to inflate your GDP fast? Spend billions on tanks and jets. That's a sure way to do so. The US spends more on military than the next 10 countries combined. The spending pumps the GDP, but does it help the average person? That's a real question. Meanwhile, Canada barely spends 2% of its GDP on defense. That's not necessarily bad, unless you ask NATO, but it means Canada's GDP isn't bloated with weapons manufacturing. So, GDP growth can reflect how a country chooses to spend. And here's a quick history of the obsession with GDP. It wasn't always the God metric. It took off around World War II when government needed a way to increase the productivity and just generally measure it during wartime. It stuck around because of its simplicity. It's very easy to calculate, easy to compare, and easy to manipulate. Economists love it, politicians worship it, but people live in the real economy, not spreadsheets or numbers. Canada might have a smaller economy, but it's punching above its weight in some key ways. For example, universal healthcare, higher life expectancy, lower gun violence, more social mobility, and if you're broke, you're not totally screwed. Canada also has a more stable banking system, so during the 2008 financial crisis, US banks simply collapsed. Canadian ones, they barely flinched. And let's be honest, nobody's moving to Canada for the GDP. That's what the US is famous for. They're moving for peace of mind, safety, and universal maple syrup access, obviously. But let's not think that Canada is perfect. It's absolutely not. Let's not pretend it's a utopia. Canada has a lot of issues. There is an affordability crisis, a sluggish innovation sector, a brain drain to the US due to higher salaries in the States, and the government that somehow manages to spend more but build less. GDP-wise, it's heavily dependent on resource exports and housing speculation. So, as you can see, it's not ideal. And that can make it fragile when global demand or interest rates shift. So no, Canada is not crushing it either. It's just failing in a different way. Now let's talk happiness, because that's all we care about. And this is where things get fun. The US GDP towers over Scandinavia, but surprisingly, in most rankings, Norway, Sweden, and Finland always dominate the happiness index. The question stands: why is this the case? Let's take a look. The reasons are affordable childcare, strong public transit, work-life balance, trust in institutions. Can you imagine? And none of that is measured in GDP. So if you're chasing a big number instead of a good life, you might end up with neither. And that's the really scary thing. So what's the better measure? If GDP is flawed, what should we look at? And there are a few things. I would say you should try a mix of median income, not average. Remember the story about Jeff Bezos and the bar? Poverty rate, access to basic services, inequality indexes, and life satisfaction surveys. Because the real question isn't how rich is your country. It's more like how good is your life. I think that should matter more. Yes, America's GDP dwarfs Canada's and most other countries. But that doesn't mean Americans live 10 times better. In fact, they might be working 10 times harder just to stay afloat. Canada has problems too. Don't forget that. But if you're looking at quality of life, the gap is a lot smaller than GDP suggests. So next time someone throws GDP in your face, just ask, cool stat, can I afford to see a doctor tomorrow? Thanks for watching. What do you think? Does GDP still matter, or is it time for a new scoreboard? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want more videos that break down power, money, and myths that shape our world, like, subscribe, and smash that bell like it owes you rent. Take care. See ya.